The late afternoon sun slanted low, stretching long shadows down Birchwood Lane, a peaceful suburban street lined with meticulously manicured hedges and towering oak trees. The tranquility of the scene was interrupted only by the soft hum of a black sedan, its tires gliding smoothly over the well-kept pavement. Inside the car, Malcolm Hayes drove with measured precision. His vehicle gleamed in the fading light, a testament to his fastidious care, and his own appearance mirrored that same meticulous attention to detail. In a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, he exuded a quiet confidence in every movement, as if the world was unfolding exactly as he intended. He had just closed on his new home, a sleek, minimalist property a few blocks away. The neighborhood was everything he had hoped for, calm, picturesque, and seemingly inviting. But as he made his way into a cul-de-sac, a sudden flash of blue and red lights cut through the peace, blaring in his rearview mirror. Malcolm sighed deeply. With practiced composure, he eased the sedan to the curb. The patrol car behind him stopped with a sharp hiss of its brakes, and the door swung open to reveal Officer Todd Mitchell. The man's heavy belt seemed to weigh him down as he stepped out, adjusting it with an almost exaggerated motion. Mitchell was in his early 50s, his swagger a clear mark of years spent wielding unchecked authority. His uniform was just slightly untidy, his face weathered, but it was his eyes, sharp, unblinking, and focused, that immediately locked onto Malcolm's car like a predator sizing up its prey. Malcolm rolled his window down, his expression unreadable yet alert. "License and registration," Todd barked, his hand lingering over the holster at his side. Malcolm didn't hesitate. His movements were deliberate, controlled as he reached for the documents in the glove compartment. With steady hands, he handed them over, his voice calm but firm. "Here you go, officer." Todd snatched them from his hand, scanning the license with an intensity that made Malcolm's stomach tighten. "What brings you to this neighborhood?" Todd asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. "I'm moving into a house nearby," Malcolm answered evenly, gesturing toward the back seat where a few neatly packed boxes sat. Todd's eyebrows arched, but his expression didn't soften. Instead, he leaned in closer, his voice dropping. "Funny, don't see too many people like you around here." Malcolm's gaze never wavered. "People like me?" he asked, his voice calm but unwavering. Todd's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "You know what I mean." Malcolm met the challenge with a steely stare, his composure unshaken. Todd circled the car, like a shark sniffing the water for a reason to strike. "This your car? Looks a little out of place," he remarked. Malcolm took a deep breath, his jaw tightening for the briefest moment before he responded. "Yes, officer, it's mine. Is there a problem?" Todd's face hardened. Without a word, he returned to his patrol car, returning moments later with something that made Malcolm's stomach churn. A baseball bat. Todd held it loosely in one hand, tapping it rhythmically against his palm, as he strode back toward Malcolm's window. "Step out of the car," Todd ordered, his voice rough. Malcolm's grip on the steering wheel tightened for a fraction of a second, but he didn't hesitate. He released the breath he had been holding, opened the door, and stood tall. Todd didn't expect the response. Malcolm's presence was commanding, his posture perfect, his expression unreadable. Todd raised the bat slightly, the motion meant to emphasize his authority. "You think you can just roll through here like you own the place?" he sneered. Malcolm's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Let me tell you something, officer. You might want to reconsider your approach." The words weren't shouted, but they held weight, carrying a sharpness that made Todd pause. For a moment, Todd's bravado faltered. The bat froze in his hand, but then, as quickly as it had faltered, the arrogance returned. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he spat. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his demeanor calm but unyielding. "I'm not. I'm suggesting you think about what comes next." Todd's face flushed red with anger, but before he could take another step, the sound of a car door slamming caught both their attention. A neighbor across the street had stepped outside, phone raised, capturing the moment. Todd glanced at the neighbor, his confidence faltering for just a beat. He snapped, "Get back in your car and stay there." Malcolm didn't move right away. He let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the moment to linger before responding with a cool, "As you wish." Every step back to his car was deliberate, measured. Todd hovered for a moment, staring at Malcolm. Then with a final glance, he retreated to his patrol car. Malcolm started the engine, pulling away slowly, his gaze fixed straight ahead. In his rearview mirror, he saw Todd still standing by his patrol car, bat in hand, watching him go. Malcolm's grip on the wheel tightened, but his face remained neutral. The encounter, and the unspoken tension, clung to him as he drove down Birchwood Lane. He had faced men like Todd before. Those who wore authority like a shield, hiding their insecurities behind it. But this time felt different. This wasn't just about one officer's prejudice. It was about a system that allowed it to fester. A few minutes later, he pulled into the driveway of his new home. The movers were already unloading boxes, their chatter filling the air. Malcolm parked, stepped out of the car, and took in the sight of the house. It was exactly as he had imagined. Modern, clean lines, and just enough yard space for quiet evenings. But the earlier encounter with Todd lingered, an unwanted shadow that clouded his thoughts. He helped the movers for a while, focusing on organizing the boxes, but his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he read the message. Looking forward to your first day tomorrow. The team's excited to meet you. Captain Hayes. A faint smile tugged at his lips before he pocketed the phone. Tomorrow, he thought. That's when things would change. Back on Birchwood Lane, Todd Mitchell sat in his patrol car fuming. The image of Malcolm's calm, unshakable demeanor refused to leave his mind. It wasn't the reaction Todd had expected. In fact, it made him feel exposed, vulnerable. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel. What kind of guy talks to a cop like that? He muttered to himself. Driven by indignation, Todd pulled up Malcolm's information on his patrol car's computer. He scrolled through the basics, name, age, address, muttering to himself, moving in, huh? We'll see about that. Later that evening, fueled by his need for control, Todd decided to drive past Malcolm's new house. He parked a few houses down and watched as the movers finished up and left. He saw Malcolm, calm and unruffled, carrying boxes into the garage as if it was his rightful place. Todd's jaw clenched as he saw the ease with which Malcolm moved, as though he belonged here. Todd stepped out of his patrol car, striding toward the house. Evening, he called out, his voice carrying enough weight to demand attention. Malcolm looked up, his expression as neutral as before, but with a sharp edge of alertness. Officer Mitchell, something I can help you with? Just doing a routine check, Todd replied, the words casual but his tone dripping with hostility. Wanted to make sure everything's in order. Malcolm crossed his arms, leaning against a stack of boxes, his posture unyielding. I appreciate your thoroughness, but I think we both know there's nothing out of order here. Todd's eyes narrowed, the words coming out like a challenge. I don't know, Hayes. You show up out of nowhere driving that car, moving into this neighborhood. Some folks might think that's unusual. Malcolm paused, letting the silence stretch between them before responding. Officer, I'd recommend you choose your words carefully. Todd took a step closer, his hand resting on his belt. Or what, he sneered. You gonna call someone? File a complaint? Go ahead. I've been here 20 years. I know how things work around here. Malcolm stood taller, his calm presence now charged with an undeniable edge. This is my home now, and I won't be intimidated. Not by you, not by anyone. For a moment, Todd hesitated, but the silence was broken by the sound of another door slamming. A neighbor had stepped outside, phone raised. Todd glanced at them, his confidence faltering once again. Get back in your car, he barked, his voice cracking with frustration. Malcolm didn't budge. He stood still, allowing the tension to hang in the air before finally saying, as you wish, and returning to his car. Every movement deliberate, controlled. Todd lingered for a moment longer before he walked back to his patrol car, watching Malcolm drive away. The baseball bat remained loosely gripped in his hand as he disappeared into the distance. The next morning, the precinct was buzzing with activity. Officers moved between desks. Phones rang incessantly, and the smell of coffee lingered in the air. Todd leaned against his desk, idly chatting with the younger officer about the previous night's patrol. Quiet night, Todd muttered. Except for this one guy. Thinks he owns the place. Rolling through town in his fancy car. Probably won't last long here. The younger officer chuckled nervously, sensing the bitterness in Todd's tone. But before the conversation could continue, The sound of heavy footsteps and murmured voices silenced the room. The precinct lieutenant stepped into the bullpen, his voice booming. "All right, listen up," he called, waving everyone toward the central meeting area. "We've got an important introduction to make." Officers exchanged curious glances as they gathered. Todd crossed his arms, his smirk fading into a look of growing curiosity. The room quieted as Lieutenant Perry cleared his throat. "This morning, I have the honor of introducing your new captain," he announced with pride. "Captain Malcolm Hayes." The doors to the bullpen swung open, and in walked Malcolm, dressed in a sharp navy suit. His presence filled the room, commanding attention the moment he entered. The same quiet authority that had unsettled Todd last night now carried a heavier weight. Malcolm was in charge. For a moment the room was silent. Some officers smiled, offering polite nods, while others stood frozen, processing the sudden shift. Todd, however, felt the ground shift beneath him. His face drained of color as he met Malcolm's gaze, calm, unwavering, and utterly unreadable. Malcolm stepped forward, addressing the room with measured authority. "Thank you, Lieutenant Perry. Good morning, everyone," he began, his tone steady. "As your new captain, I'm looking forward to working with each of you. Accountability and integrity will be our foundation." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Todd's arms dropped to his sides. He was no longer in control. Malcolm's eyes swept the room, ensuring his message had been received. "I'll be meeting with each of you individually in the coming days. Change isn't always easy, but it's necessary. Together, we'll set the standard for professionalism and respect." As the speech ended, polite applause filled the room, but Todd stood stiff, his face a mixture of disbelief and dread. He tried to blend in, but the weight of Malcolm's presence hung over him like a shadow. Later, back at his desk, Todd's pulse raced as he replayed the events in his mind. How could this be happening? The same man from last night. He glanced at Malcolm's office, the door slightly ajar, and saw him sitting inside, calm and composed, radiating the same unnerving authority. Before Todd could dwell on it further, Perry approached. "Captain Hayes wants to see you," he said, his voice firm. Todd's stomach dropped. Now, his unease was palpable. Without another word, Perry turned and walked away, leaving Todd standing there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Malcolm's usual confidence had completely evaporated. His eyes flickered up when the door creaked open, and there stood Todd, hesitating at the threshold. Without a word, Malcolm motioned toward the chair opposite his desk. "Officer Mitchell," Malcolm's voice was steady, his tone a quiet command. "Have a seat." Todd obeyed, his back stiff as a rod, hands gripping his thighs like they could anchor him to the ground. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing as he locked eyes with Todd, watching him with a cool intensity. "I think you know why you're here." The words hit like cold steel. Todd's body stiffened, his muscles taut with discomfort. He didn't move, didn't dare to. His mind raced, trying to predict where this conversation would lead. Malcolm, still leaning forward, kept his calm demeanor, his eyes unwavering. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. It felt louder than any reprimand. Finally, Malcolm broke it, picking up a pen from his desk and rolling it between his fingers as he spoke again. "Last night, I had an encounter with one of our officers," Malcolm began, his tone flat, though there was something pointed in his words. "It was enlightening, to say the least." Todd's throat tightened, a knot twisting as he struggled to keep his face neutral. "I see," he said, though his voice cracked, betraying his discomfort. Malcolm placed the pen down slowly, his hands now clasped on the desk in front of him. He leaned back in his chair slightly, his calm gaze never leaving Todd. "Let me be clear, Officer Mitchell," he continued, his voice even but carrying an undeniable weight. "I'm not here to rehash last night's events. Yet. I'm here to set expectations. This precinct will operate on a foundation of respect, professionalism, and integrity. That is non-negotiable." Todd shifted uneasily in his chair, his discomfort growing palpable. He couldn't hide the subtle twitch of his jaw. "With all due respect, Captain Hayes," Todd began, his voice stiff, but trying to hold on to his years of experience. "I've been with this department for over 20 years. I know how to do my job." "I'm sure you do," Malcolm responded smoothly, a hint of challenge in his voice. But I'm here to ensure that everyone, myself included, holds themselves to a higher standard. That means treating every citizen with dignity, regardless of their appearance." The words hung in the air like a sharp warning. Todd's mouth opened, but no words came out. Something in Malcolm's tone silenced him, a subtle but unmistakable threat. Malcolm continued, his gaze now colder. "I don't need to remind you, Officer Mitchell, that this badge comes with immense responsibility. It's not just about enforcing laws, it's about building trust. And trust starts with accountability." Todd's face flushed, his hands twitching in his lap. His gaze dropped to the floor, avoiding Malcolm's steady, unwavering stare. "Understood," Todd muttered, his voice small, his pride bruised. Malcolm studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then leaning forward he spoke again, his voice low but firm. "Good. Then I trust there won't be any repeats of last night's behavior. Am I clear?" "Yes, Captain," Todd answered, his words clipped, his anger simmering beneath his forced compliance. Malcolm studied him for a moment longer, taking in Todd's uneasy posture, his restless hands. Then, leaning back in his chair with a controlled exhale, he dismissed him. "That'll be all for now, Officer Mitchell." Todd stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His eyes flickered to Malcolm one last time before he turned and walked toward the door. The weight of the encounter lingered in the air like a heavy fog, gnawing at him with every step. As the door clicked shut behind him, the tension that had built up in his chest seemed to explode outward. His mind raced, a whirlwind of indignation and unease. Back in the office, Malcolm sat in the silence, unmoving. He exhaled deeply, his composure flawless, the calm center in the storm. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready. Todd, meanwhile, couldn't shake the meeting from his mind. He sat at his desk, a stack of unfinished reports in front of him, but all he could do was replay Malcolm's words over and over, each one sinking into his pride like a knife. "Who does he think he is?" Todd muttered under his breath, staring at the pile of paperwork. His hands clenched into fists, but the memory of the baseball bat, the night before, haunted him. For the first time, a twinge of regret stirred in him. But it was fleeting. He quickly masked it with defiance, pushing the thought away. As the day dragged on, the weight of the situation settled deeper within him. The truth was undeniable. Malcolm Hayes wasn't going anywhere. And Todd had just painted a target on his own back. In his office, Malcolm sat alone, gazing out the window at the parking lot below. The meeting with Todd had unfolded exactly as he had expected, tense but necessary. There was no anger in Malcolm, only a quiet resolve. He wasn't interested in revenge, he was interested in change. Change, however, was never easy, especially in institutions resistant to introspection. Malcolm's phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him from his thoughts. The message was from an old colleague, a simple note of encouragement. "Good luck with the new post. Hope you're ready for the challenges ahead." Malcolm smiled faintly, his fingers brushing over the screen as he typed a quick reply. "Always ready." He leaned back in his chair, his mind returning to the encounter on Birchwood Lane. It wasn't just about Todd. It was about the culture he had stepped into, a culture that needed to be reshaped from the inside out. Malcolm Hayes was determined to do just that. Meanwhile, Todd's frustration boiled over as the day wore on. Every glance from his colleagues felt like judgment. Every conversation seemed to carry hushed whispers behind his back. His confidence, once solid as a fortress, was crumbling under the weight of Malcolm's words. By the end of his shift, Todd found himself lingering in the locker room, his mind replaying the events of the previous night. The baseball bat, Malcolm's unwavering presence, the quiet authority in his voice that now echoed in Todd's mind like a familiar, haunting refrain. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Lieutenant Perry stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. "Mitchell, Captain Hayes wants to see you again," Perry said, his voice leaving no room for debate. Todd's chest tightened. He forced a calm breath. "All right," he said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension. He followed Perry down the hallway, the sound of his boots echoing ominously in the quiet of the precinct. When Todd entered Malcolm's office, he found the room bathed in warm light, the blinds drawn to keep the outside world out. Malcolm was seated, calm as ever, his posture commanding yet composed. "Have a seat," Malcolm said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Todd hesitated for a moment before lowering himself into it, a reluctant weight hanging over him. Malcolm leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "I've been thinking about last night," he began, his tone steady. "And I think it's important that we clear the air." Todd's body tensed involuntarily. He hadn't expected this. He braced himself for the reprimand he thought would come. But Malcolm's tone was anything but angry. It was calm, almost unnervingly calm. "Let me be clear," Malcolm continued, his voice unwavering. "I'm not interested in humiliating you, Officer Mitchell. I'm interested in understanding why someone with your experience felt the need to behave the way you did." Todd's breath hitched. I thought I was doing my job," he said, the words slipping out, but lacking any real conviction. "Your job?" Malcolm repeated, his gaze sharp. "Does your job include intimidating unarmed civilians with a baseball bat?" Todd's gaze dropped to his hands, his knuckles white as they gripped the edge of the chair. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he muttered, his voice quiet, barely a whisper. "But it did," Malcolm said, his voice firm, cutting through Todd's excuses. "And if that neighbor hadn't been watching, who knows how far it would have gone?" Todd swallowed hard. The image of the neighbor, phone in hand, haunted him now more than ever. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Start by owning it," Malcolm said, his words slow and deliberate. "I'm giving you this opportunity, not because I owe it to you, but because I believe people can change. But change starts with accountability." The words hit Todd like a freight train, crushing what little defense he had left. For years, he had relied on his authority to shield him from consequences. But now that shield felt like nothing more than paper. Todd looked up, meeting Malcolm's gaze for the first time. He didn't see anger there. He saw quiet determination, a steady resolve that made Todd feel smaller than he ever had before. "I was wrong," Todd said, the admission tasting bitter on his tongue. "I let my assumptions get the better of me." Malcolm nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "It's a start," he said. "But words mean nothing without action." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, letting the silence settle between them. Finally he spoke again, his voice low but resolute. "I want to be absolutely clear, Officer Mitchell. This department will not tolerate behavior like what I experienced last night. Not from you. Not from anyone." Todd nodded, his face grim but accepting. "Understood, Captain." Malcolm's tone softened just a touch, though the command in it was unyielding. "Good. I'll be watching. How you choose to move forward is entirely up to you." Todd stood, slower this time, his movements deliberate. "Thank you for giving me a chance," he said quietly, his voice small but sincere. Malcolm met his gaze. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just do better." As Todd left the office, the weight on his shoulders felt heavier than ever. But for the first time in years, something stirred within him. Something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. The need to change. Back at his desk, Malcolm exhaled deeply, settling back into his chair. He knew that Todd's journey toward accountability wouldn't be easy. But that wasn't his job. His job was to create a culture where actions had consequences, and integrity was the standard. Malcolm looked at the file on his desk, an outline of the department's first sensitivity training session. It was just the beginning. But it was a beginning, and Malcolm was determined to see it through. Malcolm leaned in, his voice unwavering, the weight of his words sinking in. "That's good to hear. But remember, it's not just about what you say. It's about what you do. Real change demands action." Todd nodded, a hint of humility flickering across his face. He was ready to dive into the work, no matter the cost. One of the first things Malcolm did was organize a community meet and greet at a local park. Officers stood side by side with residents, answering questions, listening to their concerns, and opening themselves up to vulnerability. It was an effort to rebuild the bridge of trust, a bridge Malcolm knew had been broken for far too long. Todd attended, though reluctantly at first. He wasn't sure what to expect, but as he moved through the crowd, something unexpected happened. He began to see the power in Malcolm's approach. He found himself talking to people who had been wary of the department for years. A young boy walked up to Todd, his hands twitching with nervousness. "Can I get a picture with you?" he asked, almost whispering. Todd hesitated for a split second before kneeling down, offering a genuine smile. The photo snapped. A small, seemingly insignificant moment, yet it left a lasting imprint on him. From across the park, Malcolm watched quietly, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't about changing Todd overnight. No, it was about planting seeds. Seeds that, with time and care, would grow. And as the weeks stretched into months, the precinct began to change. Complaints about officer behavior lessened. The public's perception softened. Positive interactions between officers and residents increased. Malcolm's policies were more than just words. They were tangible actions that made a difference. For Todd, the journey wasn't simple. He struggled, confronting his own biases and his own history. There were uncomfortable moments, ones that forced him to reflect on the past and question his decisions. But with every passing day, he found himself more open to listening, to learning, to evolving. The precinct began to buzz with a new energy. Officers who had once resisted Malcolm's changes began to embrace them, leading by example. Some still grumbling about the tougher policies, the mandatory trainings. But slowly, the culture of the department was shifting, and Malcolm's steady presence was at its core. Todd, who had once been a vocal skeptic, found himself softening. The community, once seen through a lens of suspicion, now appeared to him as individuals. Human beings with stories, with lives not unlike his own. One evening, Todd was called to a domestic disturbance in a neighborhood he rarely patrolled. When he arrived, he found a frightened mother clutching her son. They were both visibly shaken. The boy had been accused of trespassing on a neighbor's property, but something about the details didn't sit right with Todd. He approached them, his voice steady, calm. "Ma'am, I'm here to help," he said. His tone was unthreatening, almost gentle. "Let's talk about what happened." The mother, initially wary, began to open up, and Todd listened carefully, jotting down notes, assuring her that the situation would be handled fairly. By the time he left, the tension had eased. The family thanked him for his kindness, and as Todd walked back to his patrol car, a strange sense of pride swelled inside him. He had defused the situation without raising his voice, without escalating the conflict. It felt right. The next morning, Todd found himself in Malcolm's office once more. But this time something was different. Todd stood tall, his posture exuding a quiet determination. "Captain," he began, "I wanted to thank you." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "For what?" he asked, his voice calm yet probing. Todd's words tumbled out, heavier than he expected. "For pushing me to be better. I've been on this job for over 20 years, and I thought I had it all figured out. But I didn't. Not really." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "It takes courage to admit that," he said, his voice low but understanding. Todd's lips curved into a small smile. "I just wanted you to know. I'm not fighting this anymore. I see what you're trying to do, and I'm on board." Malcolm's gaze lingered on Todd for a moment. Then he nodded, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Good. Because this isn't just about you or me. It's about building something better for everyone." The two men exchanged a firm handshake, a wordless acknowledgement of how far they'd come. Months passed, and the precinct was no longer a place of discontent and discord. It had become a model of reform. Officers who once resisted Malcolm's changes now led by example, mentoring the rookies and instilling a culture of respect and accountability. Complaints from the community were replaced by letters of gratitude, notes of appreciation that filled Malcolm's inbox. His reforms had caught the attention of others, even at the state level. Conversations began swirling about adopting similar policies in other departments. But for Malcolm, it was never about recognition. No, it was about creating something lasting, a legacy of integrity and trust. Todd Mitchell, the officer who had once been the loudest voice against change, now stood at the forefront of that transformation. He volunteered to lead workshops on de-escalation techniques. He sat on community panels, sharing his journey from skepticism to acceptance. One evening, after a particularly moving panel discussion, Todd found Malcolm near the exit. "Captain," Todd said, his voice filled with curiosity, "I wanted to ask you something. How did you stay so calm that night when Malcolm looked up at him, his gaze steady, thoughtful. I've learned that anger doesn't solve anything. Staying calm, it's not easy, but it's necessary if you want to change minds. Todd nodded, the respect he had for Malcolm deepening. Thank you for not giving up on me, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Malcolm's reply was simple but firm. Don't thank me. Just keep doing the work. The story of Malcolm Hayes and Todd Mitchell didn't end with their precinct. It became a shining example of what could happen when accountability and empathy replace complacency and bias. Malcolm's leadership, combined with Todd's transformation, sparked something greater, a movement of reflection, adaptation, and growth. While there was still work to be done, the seeds of change had already been planted, and the path forward seemed clearer than ever before. The precinct, once a symbol of outdated practices, now stood tall as a beacon of reform. Officers carried themselves with renewed pride, their work rooted in integrity. The community, once skeptical, now saw the precinct as a partner and ally. The changes weren't easy, but they were proof that progress was not only possible, it was inevitable. For Malcolm, the journey was far from over. As he sat in his office one evening, reviewing the department's latest reports, he couldn't help but feel a rare sense of satisfaction. The numbers were encouraging, complaints had decreased, community involvement was up, and morale among the officers was higher than ever. But Malcolm knew this was just the beginning. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was an email from a neighboring city's police chief, asking for advice on how to implement similar reforms. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a moment to reflect. His efforts were creating ripples that spread far beyond his precinct. Meanwhile, Todd Mitchell, the officer who had once resisted change, found himself in an unexpected position. He was now a mentor, a guide for younger officers, sharing the lessons he had learned the hard way. His transformation had earned him the respect of both his colleagues and the community. One evening, Todd attended a community forum where officers and residents discussed how to strengthen their partnership. Standing before the crowd, Todd spoke with sincerity. I've made mistakes in the past. Mistakes I'm not proud of. But I'm here today because I believe in doing better. Not just for myself, but for all of us. The crowd responded with applause, and Todd felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Afterward, a young officer approached him. Sir, your story, it inspires me. I hope I can become the kind of officer you've become. Todd smiled, patting the young man on the shoulder. You'll get there. Just remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to grow. Later that evening, Todd and Malcolm crossed paths in the precinct hallway. Malcolm, carrying a stack of files, stopped when he saw Todd. The two men exchanged a look of mutual respect. Late night? Todd asked, gesturing to the files in Malcolm's arms. Always, Malcolm replied with a small smile. Change doesn't wait. Todd nodded thoughtfully. Well, if you ever need an extra hand, you know where to find me. Malcolm chuckled, his voice warm. I'll hold you to that. As Todd walked away, Malcolm watched him go, knowing that Todd's journey was a testament to what could happen when fear and pride were replaced by accountability and growth. Change was possible, necessary even. The story of Malcolm and Todd had become more than just a local success. It was an example of what could be achieved when perseverance, integrity, and belief in the possibility of change came together.